story that you will hear today about Ann Lowe. We are fortunate to have with us Lois's daughter, Joyce Bailey, who has taken over the work that her mother pioneered. And we are all very grateful for the work that she is doing. The Humanities Council has presented many salons and programs over the last several months on a wide range of subjects: civil liberties, Islam in a modern world, fishing in the city, the redevelopment and gentrification of Southwest, for volunteerism and philanthropy, and many, many other pertinent subjects. But I'm here to tell you today that what Washington wants to talk about is fashion. We've been really, really pleased by the buzz and the response that people have made to this program. I want to ask Joyce if she would come now and introduce the presentations. And then after that, we'll ask Edith Mayo to take over.
Good afternoon. Since its beginning in 1979, the Black Fashion Museum has been dedicated to dispelling the myth that people of African descent are newfound talent in the creative fields of fashion. Started in New York City by my mother, Lois K. Alexander, the museum also was dedicated to showing the Black community another facet of their heritage. Mrs. Alexander had a love of fashion her whole life, and although she spent 30 years in a government career, she also was a reporter, a community activist. She dedicated much of her time to her school in Harlem, which was the Harlem Institute of Fashion, started in 1969, and then of course she started the museum. She was determined to let the nation know that people of African descent had made major contributions to the fashion industry. Therefore, on behalf of the Black Fashion Museum, also known as DFM, I thank you for joining us in the acknowledgement of the first recognized African-American designer, Ann Lowe. With us today are members of the Lowe family, and they will be introduced at a later point on the program. And now let's meet Ms. Lowe. Ann Lowe was born in 1898 in Clayton, Alabama. The daughter and granddaughter of seamstresses who designed for Southern belles. Following the death of her mother, Ann started her designing career at the young age of 16 when she finished 4 ball gowns for Mrs. Emmett O'Neill, who was the wife of the governor of Alabama at that time. Mrs. Lowe took great pride when she was told that her work equaled that of her mother. By 1920, at the age of 21, Mrs. Lowe was one of the leading dressmakers in Tampa, Florida. She owned her own dress shop, which was known as Annie Owens. From 1924 to 1929, Ann Lowe designed for the Gasparilla, Queens, and their courts. And this was the first time that an African-American woman did the gowns for the queens and the courts. And the gowns were exquisite gowns, the type that you would expect to see in a Hollywood movie. They were gorgeous from a distance, and Ann Lowe's gowns were gorgeous close up, which some of the others at one time were not. During the 30s and 40s, Mrs. Lowe, having now moved to New York City, periodically worked for other people's shops and her own. It was during this time that she began to create designs that could be found in Henri Bendel, I. Magnum, and Neiman Marcus. In 1947, the white strapless gown worn by Olivia de Havilland, when she accepted the Academy Award for her In 1953, Ms. Lowe created bridal gown worn by Jacqueline Bouvier for her marriage to John Kennedy, Senator from Massachusetts. Jackie, probably influenced by her mother and her fiancé, requested a tremendous dress from Ann Lowe, a typical Ann Lowe gown. Miss Lowe reached back in her memory and sketched an old-fashioned ball gown, like the ones her mother used to make for the Southern Belles in Clayton and also Montgomery. John Kennedy thanked Mrs. Lowe for making his wife look so lovely. In 1960, Ms. Lowe was working for Saks Fifth Avenue, and the Adams room opened especially for her. Unfortunately, she realized too late that gowns that she was putting $450 in were being sold for $300. Even in her own shops, her clients rejected her prices, fixed their own, and often exploited her. Amid financial problems and failing health, Ms. Lowe was awarded the Couturier of the Year Award in 1961. By the end of her career, Ms. Lowe had designed haute couture, debutante, and bridal gowns for America's most elite society, including the Rockefellers, the Cabots, the Roosevelts, DuPonts, Vanderbilts, Colgates, and Oshkosses, among others. Her name was listed in the National Social Register. She had become a status symbol for millionaires' daughters. They were either making their views or marching down the church aisles. Ms. Lowe is credited with saying, "All the pleasure I have had, I owe to myself." She died on February the 25th in 1981. She is truly missed. We invite you to join us later at the event to view some of her designs. In closing, I'd like to recognize and say thank you to the BFM staff members present. If you can present, please stand.
Hello, my name is Edith Mayo, and I'm curator emeritus at the Smithsonian's Museum of American History. I was fortunate enough to be the curator of the First Lady's collection, and I was interested in the Ann Lowe story because not only with the Jacqueline Kennedy connection to Ann Lowe, but also because it reminds me very much of another African-American designer here in Washington whose story is intertwined with that of another First Lady, Mary Lincoln. And I will get to that in a few moments. But the way that Ann Lowe happened to design Jacqueline Kennedy's gown and the story that goes along with it, I think is typical of Ann Lowe's dedication to her work and to her clients. She had been designing for Jacqueline's mother, Mrs. Auchincloss, from the early 1930s. And in 1953, Mrs. Auchincloss asked Ann Lowe to design Jacqueline Bouvier's gown for her marriage to John F. Kennedy. She had also designed Jackie's debutante gown when she was presented into society. Not only did she design the wedding dress, but she also designed the gowns of Jacqueline's 15 bridal attendants. The dress was 50 yards of French silk chiffon, and it took 8 weeks and thousands of hand stitches to complete. But then disaster struck. Just after the dresses of the entire wedding party were completed, a pipe in Ann Lowe's workshop broke, ruining the wedding dress and 10 of the 15 bridesmaids' dresses. Ann Lowe quickly had her suppliers provide her with more material, and she recut the very intricately detailed gown, and with her whole staff working overtime, she finished the gown before the wedding. And she took the gowns to Newport herself. She said she didn't want to let them out of her sight, and presented them in person. But having to remake those gowns cost her dearly in a financial way. She never told Jacqueline's mother about the disaster in the workshop, and so she was never reimbursed for the gowns she lost. This was typical of some of her dedication, I think. And her story is not unlike that of Elizabeth Keckley, who was a dressmaker to the elite women of Washington in the 1860s when President Lincoln was elected. And when Mary Lincoln came to Washington, her first question was, where do the elite fashionable women go to get their wardrobes made? And she was told that everyone went to Elizabeth Keckley. Keckley had been born in Virginia. She was a slave, and then she bought freedom for herself and her son, and then moved to Washington, D.C. and set up her dressmaking shop. She had a very elegant shop here with a parlor in the front so that these wealthy women could wait in their apartments. She had a private fitting room, and then she employed a number of seamstresses upstairs in her workshop. And moved to St. Louis, where she was very talented as a seamstress and designer, and was able to save enough money so she became more than just Mary Lincoln's dress designer. She also became her best friend and her intimate, as well as her traveling companion. After the assassination of Lincoln, the press really assailed Mary Lincoln on every front. And thinking that she was helping to defend Mrs. Lincoln, Elizabeth Keckley was persuaded to write a book called Behind the Scenes. And in thinking that she was defending Mrs. Lincoln against attack, she revealed a number of personal pieces of information in the Lincoln household. And Mary Lincoln felt very betrayed, and that ended their friendship. Unfortunately, it also ended Keckley's career because so many people perceived that she had done in order to make money, which was not at all the case. But nevertheless, her work and her shop met their demise as a result of her publication of this book. So I would like to point that out, that both of these women were dressmakers to a very wealthy and elite white clientele, but ultimately, because of that kind of business relationship, they ended up without very much money at the end of their lives, and were very dependent on others, unfortunately. So I hope that in resurrecting Ann Lowe's career and the wonderful contributions that she made, all of us can take pride in the work and in the contributions to fashion that were made by these two women, African-American designers. And we have a very special program for you today. The first speaker is Mr. Carol Gibbs. He's an author, writer, lecturer, and exhibitor of historical artifacts, and one of Washington's eminent resources on African-American history. He's the author of The Afro-American Inventor, Black Explorers, Black Inventors, From Africa to America, the children's book Friends of Frederick Douglass, and the co-author of Black Georgetown Remembered. His new book, Black, Copper, and Bright, the District of Columbia's Black Civil War Regiment, will be published this September. Mr. Gibbs' writings have appeared in numerous publications, including the Negro History Bulletin, American Visions magazine, which I'm happy to say was sort of fostered at the National Museum of American History at its very beginning. He's also written for the Washington Post and the Washington Times. Mr. Gibbs has worked as a consultant to the D.C. public school system, Georgetown University, the Smithsonian Institution, and Maryland Public Television. He is a writer, researcher, and narrator for Sketches in Color, a 13-part companion to PBS, the Civil War series for WHUT. Mr. Gibbs has given lectures and presentations for public libraries, social and civic events. He's also an honorary Paramount Chief of the VI, is that the correct pronunciation? People of Liberia in West Africa. He's going to present a slideshow today for us. And please help me welcome Carol Gibbs.
Good afternoon. I want to begin first by thanking the council for inviting me. I really appreciate it. And I want to especially thank the Black Fashion Museum, because when they oftentimes couldn't get the interest of anyone else to talk about Ann Lowe, they still trumpeted her achievement. They, and led by Lois Alexander and Joyce Bailey, were certain, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that her unique contributions, Ms. Lowe's contributions, deserve a wider audience. And I know, I appreciate how much, I think, sense of achievement they have in something like this today. So I do want to acknowledge that, as well as the family, because what could we say? They give us a living link to this wonderful woman. In 1953, when Ann Lowe came down to Washington to do the initial fittings for the dress for Jacqueline Bouvier, she had a chance to visit her old friend, Lois Alexander. And I'm sure both women were overjoyed. You can understand, I think, that they had so much in common. Here were two women who, at a time when women didn't do those sorts of things, had carved out careers for themselves in fashion. We have Ann Lowe with her patrician manners and incredible talent, joining in spirit and in substance with Lois Alexander, who also felt the same way about her craft. Both women seem to understand that fashion is not only a business, but it's also an art. And so they brought an appreciation of what both things were to this task. In fact, I think that when Ms. Lowe came to this self-same neighborhood to visit, I think she could probably also understand something else. The period of the city's history between 1950 and 1960 was one of tumult. The African-American community was in a fervor, if you will, because we had reached a new phase in the struggle for civil and social rights. You know, in this neighborhood, parenthetically, it needs to be said that this neighborhood was no stranger to Jacqueline Lee Bouvier. You know, she graduated from George Washington University, and just about the time she took a job as an inquiring photographer and columnist for the old Washington Times-Herald at the grandiloquent sum of $42.50 a week, she decided she needed to brush up on her skills with a camera. And she went to the very best DC had to offer. She came up to 9th and U Street and studied photography at the Capitol School of Photography, which was operated by George and Robert Scurlock, the sons of Addison Scurlock. And so we know that wherever the best talent was, whether it was Ann Lowe or the brothers doing photography at 900 U Street, Jackie was aware of it and came up to be taught by the very best. We understand as well that this area, this fight, had been long in a morning. And we want to talk a little bit about the social context of this important phase in the struggle for civil and social rights today. And so with the help of Brother Anthony and Willa, first slide, please. From the very beginning of the city's history, there had been laws that sought to trample upon and restrict the movements, the aspirations of African Americans in the District of Columbia. From the very beginning, oh no, the District of Columbia's doors didn't swing on welcome hinges for African Americans. And we need to talk about this history because for all too often and for far too long, it's been forgotten. We know that from the very beginning, the laws, drip by drip, brick by brick, that were codified from the very beginning of the city's history, found its way into this document here, known as the Black Code of the District of Columbia. Next slide. This very law, this series of laws, decided where blacks could live, where they could work, how they could move, when they could party, or when they couldn't. A gathering
like this by the laws of the Corporation of Georgetown would have been against the law because there were more than 7 black folks here. That was against the law in Georgetown. And we don't teach this aspect of the city's history today. And we should, because our young people think that the way it is today must have been the way it always was, and we know that's not true. Next slide. African Americans, free blacks, in this town, walking these streets, had to carry passes, attesting to their freedom. We know that the men carried their freedom papers in a metal can, usually right on their hip. Okay? The women carried it symbolically over their hearts, because that's what it meant. And it also meant if you lost these, you were up the creek. We have any number of times of African Americans whose papers were stolen or they lost, and they found themselves kidnapped and taken away into deep slavery in the far south. Next slide. Well, Edith has told you about Elizabeth Keckley and the connection, the spiritual connection between these two women. But there's a third woman, even today, that continues on to this tradition. As we have Elizabeth Keckley making dresses for Mary Todd Lincoln, we have Ann Lowe making dresses for Jacqueline Lee Bouvier Kennedy, and today we have Martha Dixon. Martha Dixon, you'll be able to guess who she made dresses for, because she lives in Arkadelphia, Arkansas. And I think you can figure out, yes indeed. She made dresses, she made a 1986 gubernatorial inaugural gown for Hillary Rodham Clinton. And then in 1993, she made the gown that Hillary Rodham Clinton wore to the presidential inaugural gala. So even down to today, all the way down this wonderful long haul of history and accomplishment, we find the sisters marching tall, as the young folks would say, show love represented. Next slide. One other thing you need to know about. In the Black Fashion Museum's commitment to the history, we bring you another aspect of Elizabeth Keckley's life, and that is the fact that she gave us a book about that. The book Behind the Scenes is available at the Black Fashion Museum. You may go there to read not only about her ebbs and flows about fashion, but oh no, Elizabeth Keckley was a committed black woman at an equally important time in the history of the city. And so it was that she, during the Civil War, founded the Contraband Relief Association, because she understood that it wasn't enough for her to do well if the thousands of African-American men, women, and children, whom we like to call self-emancipated. Self-emancipated means you walked off the plantation yourself. If they themselves felt the need to come here and to taste freedom, she felt they needed help, because they didn't come in Lincolns. They didn't arrive in Ford Tauruses. They came naked and barefoot and footsore. And they needed help. And she couldn't see that kind of suffering. She couldn't feel that kind of pain without stepping in and doing whatever she could. And so she tells that story in this book, Behind the Scenes. Next slide. During the Reconstruction period, a period equally unknown in our schools in the District of Columbia, African Americans rose to a position of political leadership for the very first time. And they began to enact a series of what we'll call equal access laws that they thought would stand as a timeless monument to equality. They never thought these laws against discrimination in public access and accommodation would ever be turned back. But such was the force of racism in this town, again on these streets, that they were soon forgotten and remained with the dust on them laid unenforced. Next slide. And so we see evidence of the specter of Jim Crow in the nation's capital. Oh yes, Jim Crow, that legalized system of racial discrimination that wasn't just particular to Mississippi or Georgia or Alabama, but struck hard and fast and deep and caused anguish in the African American community right here. Next slide. Next slide. But of course, African Americans always fought. There was never a time from the coast of Africa to 12th and Union where we didn't fight. And so here we have a shot of the meeting of the Washington branch of the NAACP, a picture taken in 1911, and showed many of the African Americans that lived proudly just down the street on what was called Strivers Road. Yeah, they were striving all right. They were striving for a victory. They were striving for a purpose. They were striving with an unbounded sense of hope and optimism in the history of this city. Next slide. But it was always difficult. It was always difficult. Whether it was Union Station or some other place, whether it was trying to be fed or go to school, it was always difficult. And so here we see Roosevelt may be asked to stop discrimination in Union Station, Washington, D.C. And this is Teddy. We haven't worked our way up to FDR yet. Next slide. Renting houses. This article from the Washington Bee talks about the difficulty of renting houses. Oh, we don't think anything of it. We can move from northeast to southeast, from northwest to southwest without a thought. Oh, we can stride from Capitol Hill to Georgetown and from DuPont Circle to Anacostia, but it wasn't always that way. We have one important example of that. A little-known Supreme Court case that ought to rank up there with Dred Scott, but doesn't. In 1948, it was called Hurd versus Hodge, and it involved restrictive covenants. There was a time when black folks couldn't live anywhere they wanted to in this city, when it was written into law, when it was contained in real estate contracts, that they would not accept black people. And so in the Supreme Court case, Hurd versus Hodge, 1948, it involved a series of properties in the 100 block of Bryant Street, Northwest. And when you talk about the carriage of justice and the protection of history, there are no markers on Bryant Street to talk about that Supreme Court case. No, most of us said, who versus what? No, we're unfamiliar with it, and yet it worked its way all the way up to the Supreme Court, even though well, Mrs. Hodge is quite clear. She said she'd rather have a white convict live next door to her than a Negro, no matter how educated or cultivated. This was the seriousness of the fight. And we know that the attitudes of most whites in the city during this period seemed to arc from percolating racism to frigid indifference. But luckily, that wasn't always the case. Next slide. We know, too, as well, that as Washington became a magnet and a mecca for the very best black America had to offer, as it drew doctors and writers and lawyers and educators down. Next slide. There were other things that carry along with it. This is testimony from the Truman Archives, the recollections of Judge Hasty that talk about how Ralph Bunche, whom all of us know, didn't want to come back from a foreign posting to the nation's capital because of Jim Crow. It was that serious, and it didn't matter. Sometimes we focus in this town on Duke Ellington's Washington, like Duke strode large upon these streets and somehow was invulnerable to the same racism and the same limitations that other black people had, that he somehow didn't have to feel those. Oh, he felt them. And shows and documentaries like these must take the next step to tell the story of the thousands of blue-collar black folk that waged a valiant and dignified struggle each and every day. Next slide. And it struck oftentimes, this is an article with someone that's familiar to you, I think, Bill Bojangles Robinson, and how he had a chance to bring his review into a certain national theater. Some of you might have heard of that place. And how, unfortunately, he wouldn't be allowed to show to black people, just to whites in the National Theater. Yet there are those of us who walk in those doors and don't know the history, don't know the struggle, don't know the sacrifice that had to be made in order for these things to happen. Next slide. In the 1930s, organizations like the New Negro Alliance began to picket and protest and write newspaper articles and lobby friendly congressmen when and where they could find them in order to break once and for all the bastion of Jim Crow. Next slide. And so we have March, next slide, after March, next slide. Even we have protesting against segregation, recreational areas. In 1949, a group of black kids they tried to integrate the Anacostia swimming pool. And there was a fight that broke out right there in Anacostia Park. And yet there's nothing to mark that struggle. For such might be a small and insignificant thing, just to swim, just to crawl off on a hot summer day. And yet there was a fight even for that. Next slide. Next slide. Fighting to get jobs, an equal and essential part of the struggle during the 1940s and 50s, and between the 50s and 60s, was to be able to work where you purchase. And so the New Negro Alliance of the 1930s and 1940s said, don't buy where you can't work. Next slide. Next slide. And I don't know if you can see this up here. This is a famous shot of two ladies. I think some of you can recognize at least the lady on the right, Mary McLeod Bethune, walking with that wonderful octogenarian Mary Church Turrell, and they are talking about the unfairness at a place called People's Drugstore. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, young folks, that's CBS now. This is the weekend, because these are the battle lines that we're not talking about that King led in Mississippi or Georgia. We're talking about the battle lines that stretch through the hearts and souls of people in this town who still feel yet the sting of these days, the cost of this battle. This is why I appreciate the opportunity to tell you about the kind of social context Ann Lowe and Lois Alexander found themselves in. Because this is also what was happening in D.C. in that crucial decade, the 1950s to the 1960s. This next slide was the culmination of all that had gone on before. And however good we may think it might have been in D.C., if you ask the elders, they'll tell you it was never that good. One example might suffice. In 1951, two rumple-faced, cigar-chomping, fedora-sporting, ink-slinging journalists wrote a nitty-gritty expose of Washington known as Washington Confidential. This was going to tell the truth about the underside of the nation's capital. And this is what Lade and Mortimer found out after they did their research. Quote, in Washington, a southern town with a southern mentality, Negroes are not popular, are not accepted by brothers, except by a nagging and noisy minority. But it was blacks joining with that nagging and noisy minority of whites that would give the picture of the history, of the future of the city. It was these two groups that would join together to break apart an essential parapet of that bastion of Jim Crow that encircled the black community in the nation's capital. That crucial part of that was the schools. Understand that there had been no formal schooling for black children in this town until 1862. And that pretty soon it was clear that it wouldn't be equal, or it might be separate, but it wouldn't be equal. That as early as 1869, black parents began to attempt to integrate the Washington, D.C. public schools. Not because they necessarily believed that sitting next to white kids would make them better students, but because they wanted access to equal resources. This was the crux of the battle. Next slide. But in the 1950s, Washington's school system was as rigidly segregated as any then in the Deep South. The parents and that nagging and noisy minority of progressive and liberal white folks were determined that it wouldn't stay that way. What was wouldn't be what was going to be. Next slide. And so we find that in the case of 1954, we talk about Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Yes, that's true. But Washington has its own unique part in that landmark decision. Issued separately, but in the same vein as Brown versus Board of Education, was Rolling versus Sharp. And that led to a crack in the wall of Jim Crow. The late 50s were pretty good. The previous year, there had been an end to the Thompson restaurant case and end to segregation in restaurants. The young folk here don't think about going downtown to get something to eat. But when I was born in this town, black folk couldn't do that. And to give you an idea of that meeting, that nexus between history and the loss of popular memory, the next time you're downtown and you have the occasion, walk by 725 14th Street. It's called the Colorado Building. It's downtown on the ground floor level that the Thompson Restaurant did business. It was that case in that self-same building, again unmarked, that broke the back of public accommodations discrimination in this town. So in 1953, we have the end of segregation in the restaurants. In 1954, we have a death blow dealt to, with all deliberate speed, to segregation in the D.C. public schools. Oh, things began to warm a little bit, but there was still much more work to be done. Next slide. There was still much more work to be done. Glen Echo had to be desegregated. A battle little known in our history books today. That battle was begun in 1960 with the coalescing of Howard University students. They took the time out from their studies and went out into Montgomery County and began to protest unfairness and injustice. And understand that people had their eyes on D.C. all through this struggle, particularly during the 50s and 60s. And people dealt with it in different ways. There were many whites that left the city, but those who remained understood where the future of the city lay. They understood where the future of the city's best interests were. What was called that nagging and noisy minority of liberal and progressive whites stayed with the blacks and wrote a new chapter in the history of the city. Looking back on it, a member of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights had this to say in 1962. In the eyes of the world, Washington is the window of America. By what we do here, the entire nation is judged. This is why the social and civic ferment, 1950 to 1960, is so important. After 1960, D.C. would be a predominantly African-American town. After 1960, things would never, ever be the way they were before. And the eyes of the world were on that crucial decade of struggle. Thank you very much.
Selected designers, please of Cleveland, who was for years his muse and a dear friend. Following in the footsteps of gentlemen like that is Lawrence Steele, who works in Salon. Can I have the next 3 slides? And the next slide. This is some of Lawrence's recent work, and he had previously worked at Moschino and also at Prada. And he's been on the verge of a breakthrough for the last, 5 years. And like a lot of the designers who are working now, everyone needs a claim to fame, a celebrity claim to fame. And his is designing Jennifer Aniston's wedding gown. Next slide, please. This is work by the designer Tracy Reese, who was born in Michigan. And Tracy is now based in New York, and for years worked under the label Amanda Shelley until she left that line and sort of went into a bit of a hiatus, as a lot of designers do, and then launched her own collection under her own name, and also a secondary line called Plenty. Then the next slide. This is also Tracy Reese, these slides. These are all of her signature collection. The next slide, please. And the next slide. One of the more interesting or unusual designers who's working now is Amsal Albera. Can I have the next slide? Amsal is a wedding gown designer, and she's known for the simplicity of her work. She steers clear of lots of lace and beading, and she was an early proponent of simple wedding gowns before Bureau Wedding came along, a name that you might be familiar with. Amsal also has, I believe, the only black-owned boutique on Madison Avenue, and just recently expanded it to 5,000 square feet. The next slide, please. And the next slide. This is the work of a designer called Stevie Green, who is actually well known in the entertainment industry, but has yet to achieve a greater renown outside of that field. You might be able to understand why when you see the extravagance of some of her pieces. The next slide, please. And the next slide. I included this next designer because of a certain amount of loyalty and fondness for him. He's no longer working under his own label, but this is Byron Lars. And for years, Byron put on a presentation in New York, and his collection was carried by major department stores. And he was known for his wonderful tailoring and his unique way with a shirt. He would make wrap shirts, and a single shirt would have something like a dozen different pattern pieces because he was very fond of the piecing and of the sharing and all the great detail you could put into a simple shirt. And these are some of his pieces from the early 90s. Next. Bless you. Yes, please. Quite often he referred to his source of inspiration as everything from Barbie to African nature. Next, please. the advice and the counsel that he received came from Tommy Hilfiger, who had made his fortune tapping into that same market that Russell Simmons was now going after. This is from Fat Farm. The next slide. Next slide, please. A lot of the new players include Salon, Rocky Ware, Anisha, Hulu, and probably the biggest success story is Sean John by Sean Combs. And in the space of about 2 years, the collection went from basically nothing to something like $250 million in revenue. The collection really started out as purely oversized t-shirts and baggy pants. And in the last season, he has tried to mature the collection and focus more on tailored clothing. And this was an interesting story because this was someone who came into the game with a huge reputation, great name recognition, but he also tapped into a pre-existing fashion structure. And that allowed him to get into stores like Bloomingdale's right away, and to get into stores like that in a very prominent way. He also tapped into established fashion publicists, a fashion community that was fascinated by the whole music scene. And that is one of the reasons I think why so many of these designers who come into fashion through hip-hop or through music have had a much easier time than a lot of other designers. In fact, one of the designers who is now sort of working in that field is Patrick Robinson. And Patrick Robinson now designs under the Patrick Clark collection, Patrick Clark label. And he actually started at Armani. Can I have the next slide? A lot of those Armani suits that people bought at stores like Neiman Marcus in the early 90s were actually designed by Patrick Robinson. He was the chief designer for the main Armani collection, the one that sold to department stores. And he left Milan to come to New York to design for Anne Klein. And after Anne Klein folded, he launched his own label. And I call these designers really unsung heroes because they're the ones whose names aren't on the label, but whose work has a much broader impact, I think, than a lot of designers whose names are actually on the label. Can I have the next slide? This is all Patrick Robinson. And the next slide. Great. This is from Donna Karan, circa mid-90s. And the reason that this is up there is because one of Donna Karan's chief designers during this period was a gentleman named Edward Wilkerson, an African-American who was responsible for much of, and it was interesting to me to hear the historical story of a designer who spoke up and said that a designer who had designed a gown for someone and yet someone else had been given credit for Ann Lowe story, and Amelia de Havilland, because at Halston, when the designer Randolph Duke was there, Kevin Hall was the chief assistant designer, and Kevin Hall was black, and Halston received quite a lot of attention for a gown that Minnie Driver wore to the Oscars. It was a beautiful long red gown with an asymmetrical top. And Kevin Hall made the terrible mistake of actually raising his hand and saying that he designed that dress. And that, of course, did not sit well with either Randolph Duke or Halston. And, well, Kevin Hall is now in California happily designing his own collection, and Halston has gone on without him. And Andy Mark Hankins also designs a collection that at JCPenney's. And that's a line that I think a lot of people don't really realize that there's an actual person behind it, and there's an actual young African-American male behind it. And these next slides, though, are all of Edward Wilkerson's work at Donna Karan. And And Wilkerson is now the chief designer at Lafayette 148. And that collection bears a striking resemblance to early Givhan. And thank you very much.
We'd like to thank both of our speakers this afternoon. We've learned a great deal, I think, and I'm sure that there are people who must have a few questions. We have time for about 3 or 4 quick questions, if anyone has them. We've taught you everything. Yes, there's one in the back.
I know nothing about the intricacies of how fashion gets born. When you say fashion coming out of music, what does that actually mean? How does music influence that?
Well, specifically hip-hop, the way that it's had an impact so far is a lot of the performers who were in that field created their own style. And eventually a lot of those styles, the designers who were creating those clothes that they use, Tommy Hilfiger, for example, recognized that musicians were wearing his clothes in a unique way. The often told story is that Tommy Hilfiger was going from the airport, from Kennedy Airport, and he saw a group of young men wearing his clothes, but everything was oversized. And he asked his brother, who was familiar with the entertainment industry, who the young men were, and he said, oh, well, they're in a rap group. And Tommy sort of, a light bulb went off, and he thought, wow, if these young men are buying my clothes, but they're buying them 5 times too big, and they're wearing them in a unique way, maybe I should make my silhouette bigger. They really like the logos, so maybe I should make the logos more prominent. And that was a way in which the style of a group of performers directly impacted the way that a designer created his label. Continuing in that vein, a lot of the performers started thinking to themselves, wait a minute, I'm wearing this big Tommy Hilfiger logo when I go on stage, and Tommy's making lots and lots of money. Why don't I put my own logo on something and wear it on stage? I can make money too. And that sort of snowballed into a lot of performers starting their own collections, and where their success, copycats immediately followed. And so the industry as a whole started looking to the music industry as a way to tap into a different market, as a source of inspiration, and as a marketing tool.
Yes, over here in the orange.
When you're talking about the designers, it's always been that designers have had young men or women working for them and doing a lot of the work. So is your recommendation, without being stated, that, let's say it's Wilkerson for Anne Klein or whoever it is, would that be a better way, and why hasn't it been done in that way?
So just so I understand, are you suggesting perhaps that the label itself should say that
Well, I think you need to do both, because, not all of these people have enough money to take the risk or whatever it is. It is a risk in a sense, designer. So if they're designing for someone else, that it would become the norm in the industry to say so-and-so, and maybe their last name for Anne Klein or whoever it is, and if the designers themselves push that, maybe the top designers, the ones like Donna Karen or Anne Klein, whoever owns those, would see it in that way, unless it's a threat or causes kind of a big battle right now. But again, we do have this problem here of somebody who, it's your design, and you feel very proud of it, but the fact is, if you're not an apprentice or somebody, you can't get started.
I think there are several issues there. The first, I think, in order to do what you're suggesting, is you would have to purge the industry of all ego, which unfortunately. But that's just sort of part of the deal. In exchange for the experience and in exchange for a paycheck, you are designing for this label. But what does happen is quite often the house has a specific name, and then there are designers who are working behind the scenes. Those collections become incredibly successful, people will take notice and they will try and root out who's really responsible. Case in point is the collection from Ellen Tracy. There was no Ellen Tracy. It was a manufacturer's idea for a name of a brand. But the designer who was creating that line stayed on for so long and eventually really established a signature look for that collection that now is called Linda Ann for Ellen Tracy. So those kinds of things do happen. But when there's an actual living person whose name is on the label, and then they have a design staff, more than likely what happens is when someone on that team gets to a point at which they're kind of bumping up against a wall, they just leave the company and they start their own label. And at that point, hopefully they've made the contacts and they have the experience and they can find the backing to start their own brand.
Yes, right here. Great, rundown of contemporary African American design, but I didn't hear any women's names. Excuse me if I wasn't paying attention, but where are all the women?
Now, you heard one.
Okay.
And that is, in fact, one of the great tragedies, well, CD Green. But one of the great tragedies, I think, in the industry right now is that there are so few female designers who are really getting the kind of backing and the kind of support that's necessary to become a household name. Ansel Avera, started fashion when she was looking for a wedding dress and she couldn't find something simple enough. And so she went out and she made her own dress. And the company began from there. But the wedding market is very specific, and I think it's a very different kind of beast to deal with. In mainstream ready-to-wear, there are so many stumbling blocks. And as time has passed, the design industry, the name, the face of the house has increasingly become a male one, even though it's an industry and market towards women. So it wasn't an imagination, it is a very unfortunate situation.
Yes, well, this is our last question.
Yes, I actually have two questions. One is for the young lady, very brief, and one is for the students. I wanted to know, I know this has been on the internet, email, in regards to Tony Hilfiger having made a very disparaging comment about his new clientele, about the people who are buying his clothes now, which are young, black, hip-hop. And I want to know if this is true. And I would like to ask Mr. Gibbs if he has a continuing lecture series or anything within the area.
This is a case where the internet should just be unplugged. No, Tommy Hilfiger did not make disparaging remarks about his new customers. And it's one of those things that somehow bubbled up and got out there and became part of the dialogue. And in fact, the rumor had become so drastic that at a certain point they actually had a denial on their website because they were getting so many inquiries. And the same thing has happened to Kenneth Cole, to Liz Claiborne, and quite often the offending remark is delivered on Oprah. And I don't know, I can't tell you how it starts, I can't tell you really precisely why, but it's not true.
If I could be speaking back on what Robin said, if you want a little background on how we got started, you're certainly welcome to go to the Urban Legends reference pages, www.snopes.com, and you can trace back this unfortunate things. No, it's certainly not true, but these things, of course, get started. With regard to the presentations, certainly like those of you who are DC residents to join us this fall at right down the street at the Wapiti Daniel Library at 8th and Rhode Island Avenue Northwest every Monday evening at 7 o'clock beginning September 23rd with the African Presence in Early Asia. And we're presenting a lecture series, the African History and Culture lecture series. And you're certainly welcome to call the Wapiti Daniel Library at 671-0218.
Thank you very much for your excellent questions. And at this point, we'd like to have Joyce Bailey come to the podium so that she can present the Ann Lowe family.
Prior to introducing the Ann Lowe family, I take this opportunity to say that the family is in the negotiations with a New York producer on a documentary on Ann Lowe. Also, the Black Fashion Museum's traveling tour of Stephen College, which has a section on Ann Lowe, and it's going to be in Dallas, Texas, starting in September. For Black History Month, February 2003, we'll be doing a book on Ann Lowe. And now to the family, which we are so honored to have with us this today. First, Ann Lowe's granddaughter, Mrs. Audrey Hassell, and her husband. Great-granddaughter Linda Ann Dixon and her husband, Mr. Vandals. Great-great-grandson, Mr. Chris Dixon. Cousin, Dr. Lenora Cole Alexander. And third-generation descendant, Mrs. Michelle Felder. At this point, we'll have a few words from Mrs. Linda Ann Dixon.
Ladies, the last time I spoke on behalf of my great-grandmother, I was so overwhelmed by the fascination and admiration of the public. So overwhelmed, in fact, that I literally lost my voice. So I'm glad I had this opportunity to speak on behalf again. Prior to that, I never realized the contribution she made to the fashion world and the doors she opened up for future Black designers. I remember at school as a teenager, I would go with her on the daily walks, because by that time she was almost totally blind. She was always dressed in black with gloves, hats, and match. She wore black as did most designers, basically to not outshine their creations. Now, this was the '70s, the era of mini skirts and bright colors, and I was a teenager. So I was very embarrassed walking down the street and all eyes on her. Little did I realize they were admiring this elegantly dressed Black woman. There are many things that I wish to know my family and I will be sharing in the near future in one way or another. And